All right, folks. It's good to be with you folks this morning. Tim has given you an overview of what's been happening in Canada in the Ministry of Youth for Christ, and a little bit of his story, how he got there, and God's role in all of that, which is always cool, and every one of us has a story related to that. We're going to take the next hour, and we're going to really be exploring two themes. One is the theme of who we are as people of Youth for Christ, and how do we know who we are in that. And then the other is, what's the worldwide context of what we do, and is there a role that we can play or should be playing in the worldwide context of Youth for Christ? Which anybody who knows me knows that I deeply believe that is the case. So the first half of this, we're really going to spend some time talking about identity. So who are we as Youth for Christ? And I would say to you, first and foremost, we are missionaries, both domestic and international. Now, there are people who object to that term, and I'm sorry if you object to that term, but you are part of an organization that has a mission to reach every young person of every people group in this country at minimum. And by the very nature of that, the fact that you are part of an organization that has a mission, if you are working towards that, you are by definition missionaries, whether you like that or not. Lots of people like to articulate it as, I'm a Christian youth worker, because they don't like the connotation of the word missionary. I get that. Articulate it outside of this room any way you want that makes sense, that is helpful for people to understand what you do, but your identity doesn't change. How you describe that to people can change according to the circumstance. Because I fly a lot, I find myself in this always really fascinating position. Actually, I'll begin with a Tony Campolo story first. So some of you may have heard Tony Campolo share this, where he says, when I'm flying, the person sitting beside me and I will have a small conversation, and inevitably it gets to the question, what do you do? And Tony Campolo says, I always answer that question according to how talkative I feel. If I want to have a conversation and I feel a little bit energized for the day, I tell them I'm a sociologist. If I don't particularly want to have a conversation, I tell them I'm an evangelist. Shuts it right down. I'm part of a local Rotary Club. I used something like that not long ago because I recognize, living in the secular world that we live in, how you articulate what you do can either open or close doors. So I'm a missionary. It is my identity. I love that word. I love what that means in the reality of what a missionary means, not what people have made it out to mean and what people have done with it. So when I speak at my local Rotary Club, I will almost always open with a line that says, some of you know that what I do, and some of you know less about what I do, and I'm going to share with you some stories from the work that I do. And you can either listen to a missionary up here talking, or you can listen to somebody who is a professional who works with young people up here talking, whatever you're most comfortable with. And they always have a good laugh over that. And then I go on and I tell bad jokes about lawyers. But my point is that regardless of how you articulate it, you are a missionary. And we're going to talk about what that means. You are also part of an organization that is absolutely committed to unity in Christ. The scripture tells us that it is our unity, it is the oneness in Christ that we share, that is ultimately the proof that Jesus is the Son of God. It's not what we say, it's not what we teach, it's not the theologies of all sorts of other things and whether you smoke or whether you drink or not or all that sort of stuff. What ultimately is the proof of who Jesus actually is, Jesus himself says, by this the world will know. Not that they'll suspect, not that they might kind of get an inkling, but they will know by our oneness that you truly sent me, that I am the Son of God. Francis Schaeffer once said that in that statement, Jesus gives permission to the non-Christian world to determine whether or not Jesus is truly the Son of God based on what they see in us. Think about the implications of that. The people outside of the faith have permission from Jesus to say, I don't believe in him because of what I see in you. Whoa. Holy smokes. We are one. Okay? And we are this incredible family, and we are missionaries together. We're not intended to be Lone Rangers. We're not intended to do this by ourselves. We work together both domestically and internationally. We share some things in common. So what do we share at the very beginning of this is we share our identity as missionaries, and that identity comes from somewhere. We'll talk about that in a moment. So we are missionaries, that is our identity. We share a purpose, which is to work locally in order to fulfill the mission to reach and impact the entire world with the gospel. And we are people who are called. If we are truly steeped in this identity of what it means to be a missionary, what it means to be somebody who is carrying out this vision of Youth for Christ, we do this because we are called. And that is so much more powerful than doing this because it was a good idea or because you went to Bible school because mom and dad told you you should, and this is the only thing you know how to do. Being called is a different thing. Tim talked about that, talked about his story of being called. I'm going to share a little bit of my calling as well. The other thing that is really important is for us to recognize that this is first and foremost God's mission. This is not our mission. This is God's mission. Mission is founded upon a relationship with a living, created, and intentional God. There's the intentional word, right? This is something where there's very specific things that are part of this. And our missional and ministry efforts need to reflect that reality. It's our responsibility to identify what God is doing and join with him. Flipping forward to the global stuff for a moment. One of the things that drives me crazy are things like this. I was in Liberia a number of years ago, and there was a mission team from New York City that was in the same area at the same time. And I'm just trying to remember, it was such an obnoxious name. I'm forgetting the exact name, but here's the intent behind the name was, we are bringing God to Liberia as though God had never been there. And I don't believe that's their role. I don't believe that you can bring God anywhere. You can help people, you can join with what God is doing, and you can help reveal what he's doing, and you can be part of what he's doing. But I don't think that God is going to go to Liberia because you say, get on a plane and pack him in your suitcase and take him so that you can open it up and he pops out like a genie. That's not what mission is about, right? We know this. It's about identifying what God is already doing because he is never stopping what he's doing. It's about identifying what he's doing, whether it's in your neighborhood or in some other country somewhere or in your own backyard. Identifying what he's doing, getting on board with that and being part of it. So, our identity as missionaries begins with this idea that we are children of God. We have the characteristics, if the Spirit of God is living with us, we have the characteristics of our Father. How many of you have ever been identified as so-and-so's kid? Right? Now, for some of you, that was a real positive identification. Then there's the rest of us. I had a really interesting experience growing up. My nickname is Stogie, as Tim identified earlier. My father's nickname was Stogie, my grandfather's nickname was Stogie, and my great-grandfather's nickname was Stogie. I come from a family of blacksmiths and engineers. I come from a family that just, for some strange reason, God has gifted us with the ability to crawl into a piece of machinery that we've never seen before and fix it. It just happens. So I had an opportunity for a couple of summers while I was going to college to work at an industrial plant just out of Sarnia. I was working for DuPont. My dad was an executive there. And about the second day on the job, one of the pieces of machinery in the production area that I was working in broke. And I was on the night shift. And it never occurred to me to call maintenance. So what I did was I grabbed, as my grandfather would have said, give me a screwdriver and an oil can and I'll fix that damn thing. And so I grabbed whatever tools were available. I crawled underneath this piece of machinery, and then this voice that I didn't recognize said, "Who are you?" And I said, "Just a minute." And I finished tinkering around with this, and I rolled out from underneath this piece of machinery, and the guy took one look at me and said, "You're Stogie's kid, aren't you?" Because that's just what we do. Our identity comes from knowing that we are the children of a particular father, knowing that we are a child of God, and we carry the characteristics of him with us. And my hope is that people will identify you as followers of Jesus, as children of God, because they see the characteristics of the Lord in you because of the Spirit that is working within you, because you've been adopted. So we are also, our identity comes from knowing that we are called by God. We are not just his children, we are called very specifically. So and we are called actually first to be followers. Just to unpack this a little bit, I've been a Christian for a very long time. I can hardly remember a time when I wasn't a Christian, but I can definitely remember times when I followed more closely than others. My professional background, I have a degree in jazz composition and arranging from Berklee College of Music in Boston. I graduated from that place a long time ago. I had the distinct pleasure and opportunity and challenge to work alongside some of the greats in jazz in the jazz industry. I worked alongside Count Basie for a while. I worked with Stan Kenton, with Woody Herman, with Chick Corea, with Gary Burton. These were people who I hung out with on a regular basis. When I graduated top of my class. I graduated with scholarships they had never given before, and to be truthful, I was really good at what I did. Check this out. And they left their nets at once and followed him. When God called me into the Youth for Christ ministry, he did something that I was really angry at him for a long time about. He called me to leave the profession that I loved and had trained for. It wasn't until years later I really understood why that was the case, because music actually brought me into the Youth for Christ ministry. But I'll tell you now that my pride and my ability to be self-reliant would have destroyed me in ministry. My ability to rest on my ability to fix anything, my ability to rest in the music that I was producing, the pride that I had and that came along with that when people would give me all of these accolades for the music that I had written for the Jazz Festival in New Orleans in 1983, all of that kind of stuff, it was damaging to me, and I didn't know it. And so the Lord used the music world to get me into the Youth for Christ ministry, and then promptly took away the music world. Okay? Now, I have no problem with that right now. I used to be a very good musician in a lot of ways. I'm a very average musician now because, frankly, I don't touch it anymore. I quite refer to it as a past life. But I left my nets. I left what I knew how to do, because at the end of the day, without question, I knew that I was being called to reach young people in my neighborhood, and that was a sacrifice that I had to make. What have you been called to leave so that you can follow him into this mission field? Do you know what it is? Do you know how important it is? Whoops, that was weird. Okay. So our identity comes from knowing that we are children of God. Our identity comes from knowing that we are called, and also that we are empowered. By leaving what I knew and allowing God to pour into me, I actually became way more useful to God. Took me a while to figure that out. There was an overlap of a number of years where I tried to be a professional composer and I tried to be with Youth for Christ, and I tried to do them both full time. And by the way, for those of you, if you want to hear some really ugly burnout stories, I can tell you one. It just about killed me, just about killed my marriage, just about killed my ministry. And it was high quality people that surrounded me who said to me, and this was when I first really understood it, who said, Daryl, it's your pride. You're called to be here, and you're not actually living out your calling because your pride's getting in the way. We are called by God. We're called to be children. We're called to go out. We are empowered by the Lord, and we're empowered by the Lord to bring healing and wholeness. And our identity comes from the understanding that we are called to be in a life of service. I love what I do. Yes, there are days when I miss my previous life. Not enough that I would ever go back. I loved what I did back then, but I'm called to serve. I'm called to serve the young people in my community. I'm called to serve the people who serve young people in their communities, whether it's here in Canada or whether it's around the world. And I know that. Now I get to serve at the pleasure of the King. There is nothing better than that. Do you know that as strongly? That's sort of the challenge that I'm throwing out today. We also recognize that our identity comes from knowing that we are sent. So it would be irresponsible of me to say that I don't make decisions in this work. Absolutely, I make decisions. I make decisions about where I go. It's not like I wake up every single morning and say, okay, Lord, in 2.5 years when I've got this little window of opportunity here, what country do you want me to go to? It's not necessarily that deliberate. However, I spend a great deal of time reflecting in prayer, searching scriptures, talking with colleagues, listening to what's going on before I do make some of these decisions. Well, before I make any of these decisions about where I go. Because it's this understanding that I don't want to be running ahead of God, whether it's domestically or whether it's internationally. I want to be going where God is sending me because my commitment as being a missionary is to identify what God is doing and join Him in that, as I said in one of the earlier slides. Is that all? You follow, tracking with me so far here? Okay. So, identity is what grounds you. We've all seen this, the first half of the Great Commission, right? This is very much a general calling. This is a general calling to all Christians. And do you know in your heart your specific role in calling? I'll give you a little piece of my background in this area. So it was a Thursday morning. I was sitting in the office of a little tool and equipment company, because remember, I'm both a musician and a mechanic. And when you're a musician, you don't always make as much money as you'd like to, so sometimes you have to draw on your other skills. So I ran a tool and equipment company for about 3.5 years in the town of Cobourg. I was hired to do that because, as the guy who hired me said, I want you to babysit our second store just to keep the competition out. And I just about walked out of his office because I said, I'm not a babysitter. If you want the business to do something, then hire me. If you only want a babysitter, then I can recommend a few people. And he kind of looked at me funny and thought that was a pretty brazen statement, but it was, and I was pretty prideful back then, so it made a lot of sense to me. But then he hired me. And it was fun. I loved it, and more than increased the volume of the store by about eight times by the time I left. But I'm sitting on a Thursday morning, as I did every single morning. Got there before any of my staff, opened up scriptures in this little office, prayed a little bit. My prayer was always the same: Lord, help me be a person of integrity in business. Help me to do this well. Help me to serve the people who walk through the door. Then I read this. It's from Ezekiel chapter, I got to figure out how to do this. It's from Ezekiel chapter 34, verses 11 to 16. I'm going to paraphrase, okay? For those of you who are not familiar with that passage, this is when the prophet Ezekiel is reporting that this is what the sovereign Lord says, and he talks about the Lord being the good shepherd. He says, I myself will search out and find my lost sheep. I will be like a shepherd searching for the scattered. I will bind up the weak and bandage them, or find the weak and bandage the wounded. And it goes on like that. Now, I'd been a volunteer for Youth for Christ at this point for about a year and a half, and I so clearly understood in my heart that morning what the Lord said was, I want you to do this for me. And I knew exactly what that meant. It meant quit the job. At that point, it didn't mean quit the music to me, but it meant quit the job, join Youth for Christ as a full-time staff member, and this is what you're being called to. And I kind of argued a little bit about that because I didn't want to do it. It was like, are you kidding? I'm having a blast. I get to play with all of this tool and equipment. That's one of my passions, and I get to write music. Like, why would I want to change that and mess it all up by going into ministry? 2 days later, the chairman of the steering committee for Northumberland Youth for Christ walked into my store, and he says, so Daryl, we've been chatting at the last board meeting, and we would really like you to be the director of Youth for Christ Northumberland. And my first thought was, oh, it's like twice in 2 days. I go home after that and I say to my wife, Russ came into the office today, you'll never guess what he said. And I told her what he said, and she looked at me and she says, yeah, I think it's time. Crap. Scripture, Christian leader, and my spouse, I'm doomed. And I knew that that's what I had to do. Then Russ comes back to me a little later and said, okay, so we put together the details. We can make you a great offer. You're going to make about $10,000 a year less than you're making now, and you have to raise it all yourself. And I didn't get a template. But because I knew I was called, I had to say yes. I had to say yes. That was a specific calling. So some of the things that we also begin to know, right, from our identity. Knowing that we are people who are sent. The 11 disciples, I love this. The 11 disciples going to the mountain where Jesus had told them to go, they saw him, they worshiped him, some of them doubted. Jesus came and told his disciples, I've been given all authority on heaven and earth. Jesus is, he speaks to us, we struggle, I've just identified all of that. We worship, and then what? If we are truly called, then we go. Because he tells us, therefore go. Make disciples of all nations. By the way, he doesn't tell us to rack up numbers. Numbers are important. And we need to be able to find effective ways to measure what we do. Ivy and some of the Cross Nationals and I were talking about that last night, because sometimes it's a struggle. How do you measure the development of a relationship? How do you measure a relationship that's growing? How do you quantify that in some sort of a number that you can count? You can't always do that. But there are ways. The bottom line is Jesus tells us to go and make disciples. That's our goal. Go and make followers of Jesus. That's our goal. Baptize them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. It's a Trinitarian thing. It's a relationship thing. We're not doing this by ourselves. We're called to teach. We're called to obey ourselves and teach others to obey. And we are to do this with confidence. We do not do this alone. Jesus is with us. Quick little fun God story. When I first started in this, I was fully funded very, very quickly. Before I started with Youth for Christ full-time and started to draw a salary, 125% of my support was in place. And I remember when my supervisor at the time took me to a YFC Canada leadership meeting of some sort. It was a small conference somewhere. He introduced me as being an outstanding fundraiser. And I just remember thinking, really? I hardly remember doing that. It came that easy to me. Doesn't to everybody. I get that. But I had 125% in place before I started. First 2 years of working with YFC, I was fully paid. All of my expenses were covered. Everything was just great. And then on a Friday afternoon, I would get paid every 2 weeks. On a Friday afternoon, which was payday, and I was getting ready to leave the office, I get a call from that same board member who challenged me to come on board. And Russ says to me, Daryl, we got a problem. I just got a call from our treasurer, and there's no money in the account, and there is nothing for a paycheck today. Now, I wasn't making a big salary because he was absolutely honest. I was making about $10,000 less than what I had left. Which meant that we were living from paycheck to paycheck to paycheck, which meant that there really was not a whole lot of room for movement. If you don't get a paycheck, there's a problem. My wife is pregnant with our third child, and it was Friday. Our habit was I would come home on payday, I would cash the check, we would go to the grocery store, and we would buy groceries for the next 2 weeks. So now the provider instinct in Dad is going crazy, right? And I'm thinking to myself, and guys, you will understand this more than anything else. You know how you kind of rehearse what it is you have to say to your wife, right? So I'm in my car, I'm in my office, and I'm sort of rehearsing, like, how am I going to tell Hope, my pregnant wife, when there's no food in the house, that there's no money to go out and buy food? And what do I do? And I'm trying to come up with all sorts of ways to make this feel better. Phone rings just before I walk out of the office. Elderly woman on the phone. She says, is this Daryl? Yes, this is Daryl. And she says, my name's Mary. She said, I was in the grocery store today doing my groceries, and I really felt like the Lord wanted me to pick up a few things for you and your family. And I'm immediately thinking, whoa, this is cool. And she says, are you leaving soon? And I said, well, yeah, actually, I'm just about to walk out the door and head home. So she told me where she lives, and I can tell you exactly where that is. It's across from what used to be the East High School in Coburg. There's a small apartment building there. She says, I live in that apartment building, and she said, I'll be in that parking lot if you could meet me in the parking lot. So I drive along, I pull into this parking lot, and there is this elderly lady who's about this tall, and she's standing beside a little red Toyota. This is how clear I recall this, right? She's standing beside a little red Toyota. I'd never seen her before, and I'd spoken in pretty much every church in the area. I'd never seen her before, all this kind of stuff. And I pull in, and I roll down the window, and she says, are you Daryl? And I said, yes, I'm Daryl. And she says, great. Would you mind just grabbing the couple of bags of groceries that are in the back seat of my car? So now this has already graduated from a few things for your family to a couple of bags of groceries. And I look in the back of her Toyota on the back seat, and there's 6 paper sacks of groceries. I'm old, paper sacks, got that? Okay, 6 good-sized paper sacks of groceries in the back seat. And I said to her quite politely, oh, which ones would you like me to take? Oh, they're all for you. This is her few things. Start moving these over. I get to about the 3rd or the 4th bag, and she says, oh, be careful with that one. There's an envelope in there just in case I forgot something. Now, in those days, we were spending about $100 every 2 weeks in groceries for what was then our family of 4 and my pregnant wife. I get home. So now my story to my wife has changed, right? It's, hey, honey, this is good news, bad news. Well, the bad news is that we don't have any paycheck. The good news is this is one of the biggest shopping trips I've ever been on. And in that envelope was $100. So out of that one phone call, we had enough groceries to feed our family for 2 weeks and enough money to buy another 2 weeks of groceries. As I was sharing with the Cross Nationals a little while ago, I have never since been very anxious about money. The Lord has just taken care of it. By the way, I never met Mary again. I tried to track her down. I gave her description and the description of her car to everybody I knew in every church in town. Nobody could ever identify that lady, and I never saw that car parked in that parking lot again. I'll let you draw your own conclusions as to what that means. Bottom line for me is I was called to this ministry. I left a good job, good pay. The Lord has taken care of me, and 28 years later, I'm into my 3-year commitment. Tim shared it as well. If you're called, if you are joining what God is doing, if you've identified what He's doing and you are joining in that and moving forward, you will get what you need to do that. It might not always look like a paycheck. It might not look like whatever it is that you're expecting, but you will get what you need to accomplish the ministry. So, concluding this section, I just want to encourage you. Some of you are really brand new to this ministry. I want to encourage you to do what it takes to know who you are, to know what you are called to be, which begins with being a child of God. Know what you are called to do. Have the confidence to know that you're not doing this alone. Know that your calling is shared with many. There are lots of people who have walked this path before you. There are lots of people who are walking this path with you, and there will be people who will walk this path when you're all done. And know that you are called to be one with God and one with each other so that the world may know that Jesus is the Son of God. That is the end goal. And we cannot lose sight of that. How that looks on a day-to-day basis for you, how that is articulated as you go through life and ministry will change for each one of you. But the core of that has to be the same. And you will see amazing things happen in your neighborhood, in your wider community, and the world will be different because you have followed that call. So let's talk a little bit more about what it means to be one on a much bigger scale. I was the director of Northumberland Youth for Christ for about 19 years. Sometimes I like to point out the fact that when Tim was first starting in this ministry, a few years after I did, and as he's going through that whole searching process, and he talked about the various chapters that he visited and so on, we used to get together every 6 weeks or every couple of months for coffee or for lunch at Harvey's on the 401 and talk about ministry, and he would come down and look at my youth center in Northumberland and so on. And I just, just very simply, and this isn't me, trying to say anything beyond the fact that I had a privilege. I had the privilege.
Taught me everything I knew.
No. I just want to say I'm really proud of this guy because I was one of the people that had an opportunity to encourage him when he was in his early stuff, and he's now my boss, and I love that. That's just really cool for me. So anyway, I have no idea why I said that. Oh yes, I was the executive director of Northumberland Youth for Christ. No, it's not because I want to raise, because then I just have to go out and raise it anyway. Anyway, I was the executive director of Northumberland Youth for Christ until the end of 2008. And I was, and I still am, absolutely committed to local youth ministry. I'm the director of global engagement, and people say, oh yeah, you like to do all the international stuff. And I would say, I like to do the international stuff from a global context, or from a local context. We'll talk a little bit more about that. I believe that God called me through the passage in Ezekiel that I shared with you into the ministry of Youth for Christ. I also believe that a number of years later, He called me to expand my understanding of what that meant using a passage from the 5th chapter of Luke, verses 1 to 11, where we often refer to it as the calling of the first disciples. The story is really simple. Jesus has been teaching on the shore. He says to Peter, I want to get in your boat and go out into the water so I can continue to teach. He goes out and he does that. He says to Peter, okay, now I'm done the teaching thing. Why don't you just throw your nets in the water and catch some fish here? Peter does what all good followers of Jesus do when the Lord gives an instruction. He whines and complains a little bit first. And then what he does is he says, okay, well, Lord, because you've told me this, I will drop my nets and do this. And of course, it's the catch of a lifetime. But the piece of this story that captured me, was when it says, and with a shout to his partners, on shore. And then the story continues. And I always thought, it was kind of a throwaway verse for a long time. Until I began to get involved internationally, initially as a millennial project. I'll tell you about that in a sec. And one of the things that I began to hear impressed upon me was when I would read that phrase, with a shout to his partners, I would hear my friend Augustine in Liberia say, Daryl, there's too many fish come and help us. The catch is too big. Our nets are breaking. I would hear my young, very short, beautiful friend you say from Peru call me. Daryl, the victims of the child sex trade in Peru, there's too many of them. The net is breaking. The catch is too big. Will you come and help us? And I began to understand that what the Lord was impressing upon me is that not only do we have this great privilege of being part of a worldwide mission. I don't know how many of you know this, but we're active in over 130 countries around the world. In some places, Youth for Christ is the go-to place for their governments to get good information about youth issues. Imagine a government, imagine what it would be like if we were so well respected in this country as the youth specialists that our unbelievably secular government was calling us for help. That happens all around the world with Youth for Christ ministries. I began to realize that not only do we have the privilege of being part of this, but in fact, God was calling us to be a bigger part of this. God was calling us to actually partner with our colleagues around the world. And that is part of what we are called to do as a nation. And I was beginning to understand it was part of what we are called to do as local chapters. So we're going to explore that for just a little bit. We're just going to take a look at why would it make sense for you as a local chapter to be engaged with the global ministry of Youth for Christ? What are some of the common objections and misconceptions? And beyond that, what's the reality? So here's the background. The vision of global engagement is to have every YFC ministry location in Canada connected to a ministry in another country. Tim, how many ministry locations would you say are currently active here in Canada? Good guess? Just under 400. Okay. Ministry locations can be described in a variety of ways. So ministry location can be a small drop-in center somewhere. A ministry location could be Jesse James Revolution's bicycle ministry in Willowdale. It could be what Ivy is doing in Calgary with the street workers. It can be all sorts of stuff. It can be a really large ministry with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of kids. It could be a relatively small discipleship ministry. A ministry location is any place where a Youth for Christ worker is actively engaged in reaching young people in a community. There's just under 400 places like this around the country. There's 130 plus countries that we're involved with around the world. Imagine what would happen if 2 or 3 ministry centers from different parts of Canada both said, or maybe 2 or 3 said, I'd like to partner with Nuncio in Naples and see what we could do together to reach the young people. Or they wanted to partner with Viviana in Bolivia or Kiki in Serbia. 2 or 3. We have the capacity here in Canada to do that. So my vision, and I will talk about this incessantly until God calls me somewhere else, that my vision is to see every ministry location in Canada connected to a YFC ministry in another country, so that we can engage, empower, and equip Canadians to fulfill the global vision of Youth for Christ International. And this is my favorite part, which is to see every young person in every people group in every nation have the opportunity to make an informed decision to become a follower of Jesus and become part of the local church. I go back to the every all the time. There are people groups that we don't touch in our own neighborhoods, and there are people groups around the world that don't get touched. Oftentimes the people groups that don't get touched wherever they are not being reached into because of prejudice and fear. And every single one of those people groups, God loves and wants them to know Him deeply. And we are called to be instrumental in making sure that every young person in every people group in every nation has the opportunity to make an informed decision to be a follower of Jesus and become part of a local church. So I'm going to ask you guys to do a couple of seconds of work so that I can actually have a couple of sips of coffee. I'd like you to just turn around to 2 or 3, get close, and what I'd like you to do is try to answer this question just for a couple of moments, and then I'm going to ask you to spit back some info to me. What are some of the common reasons why a chapter or satellite or ministry location in Canada would not actively engage in some form of global ministry? Okay, go. Okay. Okay, folks, let's hear a few things. Just call them out. What are all of the reasons why people would say we should not do this?
Time.
Pardon? Time. There's never enough time to do everything in your own local community. How could we possibly get involved internationally, right? That's one. Yes?
Does it line up with your mission?
Does it line up with your mission?
Or what your ministry, what you're doing in your ministry?
Right. Okay. In other words, yeah, we're just called to work with the kids in our neighborhood, right? Yeah, which begs the question when immigrants from another part of the world move into your neighborhood and you have no idea how to communicate with them. I wonder if an international partnership could help you with that. But that's a whole nother ballgame. Somebody from over here. What are some of the reasons why people would say you just can't do this or you shouldn't do this?
Misallocation of finances.
Misallocation of finances.
It costs 30 grand to send all these kids there. Why don't you just send 30 grand over? It'll pay someone for 10 years.
Yeah, heard that one a lot. Okay. Yes, Vivian.
We talked about how we assume that we will be the helpers as opposed to receiving help.
Right.
We assume that people will want money or a visit as opposed to just perhaps some encouragement or a prayer.
Right.
Because we assume that the assumption is they're going to probably take more than me that I can handle. Just don't even go, right?
And it'll go on and on and on and on. Yes?
Sorry, sometimes probably the idea could be that we need sometimes that you send money or something like that. But sometimes it's more to share what you are doing, to share how you are doing it,
Right.
how you are structured, and to see what the methods are you using or something. It's more subjective probably.
It's about sharing expertise, not necessarily money, right? Great example of that. I mean, just try to picture this. So a number of years ago, I was in Liberia. I spent a week in a camp of former child soldiers. There are about 50 former child soldiers in this camp. This was just a couple of years after the Civil War in Liberia was over. These guys talked with great sadness about how they were recruited as a young person, some of them as young as 11 years old, into a rebel army. Some of them fought for 14 years before they stopped being a child soldier. Some of them were commanded to kill members of their family so that they wouldn't be killed to prove their loyalty. And if you've ever watched Blood Diamond, there's a scene in Blood Diamond where they line up the boys with blindfolds and hand them guns and tell them to pull the trigger, and then the blindfolds come down and they realize they've shot members of their community. That stuff really happened. I've met those guys. And I'm sitting there with the guy who's the leader of this camp, who had been one of the most brutal warlords in Liberia. And I said to him, Joshua, what do you need? And he says to me, please don't send money. Can you imagine that? He says, we need your expertise. We need people who will come and walk beside us. We need people who will show these young former child soldiers that they have value and that God has not given up on them. Don't send money. I mean, really, that was not what I expected. So I'm going to ask Viviana a question. So Viviana, if there were 3 different ministries in this room who were to say to you at lunch today, Viviana, I feel like we should get together and meet with you for a half an hour every 2 weeks and pray for each other, what would that mean for you in Bolivia?
That would be very, very good. Yeah, because I think we need the prayer support and share how the ministries are. So it will be very, very good.
Right.
Because we're the start of the ministry. So sharing the things will be good.
Thank you very much. Part of the reason why I wanted to ask her that question is that when we start talking about partnering between ministries here in Canada and ministries overseas, the very first place the conversation goes to is money. Okay? And partnership is about so much more than money. Even Hector. Hector is the regional director for Central America. And he says, we need training, we need expertise, we need people who will walk with us. Yes, that might cost some money, but it's not the $30,000 price tag, right? Okay? So let me tell you a little bit about how this started for me.
Of course, the money is always good.
Good point. Very good point. So, we've only got 15 minutes, and I want to make sure that I get as much of this in as possible. In 1988, I was the volunteer music director for this small satellite of Northumberland Youth for Christ. In 1989, I was recruited to be the director of a local satellite, and I was and remain fully committed to local youth ministry. I was involved with turning the satellite into a chapter. We went through that 2.5-year process of filling out the paperwork and all of that kind of stuff. In 1998, a group of YFC folks were on tour in Canada. They called themselves Vision Africa, and their only task was to come and just share the vision of what God was doing in the African continent, or in Youth for Christ on the African continent. We hosted, in my home, we hosted the leader of that project. His name was Joseph Ayi, who became a mentor to me until he died in 2013. And as he was leaving in 1998, he said, Daryl, if you ever think about the possibility of doing a Project Serve mission, of taking a team of young people overseas, would you please consider Ghana? And I said, sure, and promptly forgot about it, because I'm committed to local ministry. I'm in that mindset, right? Year 2000 is approaching. Does anybody ever remember hearing about or participating in the 2000 acts of service for the year 2000? Right? Some of us older folks remember that. So in the year 2000, leading up to the year 2000, my wife and I were washing dishes one night, and I looked at her and I said, you know, if we were ever going to consider doing an international project, I wonder if we could do that as a millennial project. And she said, yeah, that's kind of cool. Let's do that. So never having been on a Project Serve team myself, never having had any international connections, I called people who had and said, how do we do this? And we put together a mission team, and we went to Ghana for a month in the summer of 2000. When I made that proposal to my board, I promised it would be a single event, because all of the objections came. Everything that you guys said, plus another 10 or 15, came. Right? And the board said, okay, but just this once. So, that year, we spent about $37,000 to get that team to Ghana. That year was the first year that every single staff member in Northumberland Youth for Christ was paid their full salary with leftovers. Anybody know anything about tithing? Right? What I want to say is that, well, we just learned a whole lot. The other thing that happened is we attracted in our local ministry a completely different demographic of young people that we had not ever had contact with before, because they were attracted to this idea of going on an international service mission. So all of a sudden, there were groups of young people that were coming and talking to us. They were part of we would never have been able to connect with them until we did this.
Where did they come from?
The high schools.
Okay. So these weren't necessarily believers, these kids.
Many of them were, but not all of them. Some of them were pretty nominal. They just thought it was exciting. We had a screening process. We talked through some stuff. Now remember, speaking about believers, Anne McCallum from Highlands, like she would say that It is the only part of the mission that has literally 100% success rate in seeing young people come to the Lord. And she will, because she and I have had tons of conversations about this, because I've coached her in bringing teams overseas, and she always brings the majority non-Christian kids on her mission trips, right? And I hear people, all around saying, oh, you don't want to take non-Christian kids on the mission trip. Holy smokes, they're not very spiritual, and you never know what's going to happen, et cetera, et cetera. Have you ever seen Christian kids? Right? Okay? Just because they say they're Christians doesn't mean it's going to be problem-free on your mission or that they're going to be particularly spiritual. However, we digress. Okay? So, I'm not going to ask you to answer this because I'm just going to make it a little quicker and I'm going to give some of them to you. What are some of the good reasons to engage internationally? Here's some things that we learned from doing it the first time. We reached a new demographic. We were reaching a whole new segment of every young person of every people group in our communities. By the way, that first mission trip that we went on in 2000, my board was so thrilled with the results of that, and my board recognized quite quickly that even though we were spending money to send the team overseas, of course that money is raised by the kids in the ministry and all of that kind of stuff, that they saw very quickly the correlation between us investing outside of the ministry and the Lord providing what we needed for the local ministry. And I can tell you from the many conversations I've had across Canada with this, there's not a single ministry in Canada that does Project Serve or does anything significantly globally that will say it harms their bottom line financially. It does not happen.
Can I speak to that actually?
Oh, is it happening?
No.
Oh.
We had a chapter that committed to tithing, if you will.
Oh, yeah.
10% of their non-designated general funds. The months that they didn't move those funds over, they struggled. The months that they did move those funds over, they didn't.
Yep, absolutely. I had a conversation with an executive director of a small chapter a number of years ago who said to me, I really have a heart to partner with another nation. What can I do? And I talked about the prayer thing, that kind of stuff. Just simply reach out and choose somebody, prayerfully choose somebody, decide that you're going to commit to pray with these people and just keep that going, right? And so, yeah, okay, I can do that. And he says, but I feel like I'd like to do a little bit more. So I said, what is your general account look like? What does your amount of the undesignated funds that come into your ministry every year, what's your general budget like? And he said, it's about $30,000, $33,000, relatively small chapter, okay? And I said, okay, and how are you doing with that? Like, do you meet your budget most of the time? And he says, yeah, we come pretty close. So I said, if you had a $100 a month donor who suddenly died and that money left, you'd lose $1,200 a year. Would that seriously harm your ministry? And he says, yeah, probably not. It wouldn't put us under. So I said, then technically, you could afford to send $100 a month to somebody else who needs it. I'm not sure he was all that pleased with my logic. But he kind of smiled and he said, you're right. And I said, okay, let me tell you about, and I told him the story about the national director of YFC in Nepal who was living on $75 a month. And I said, what would it be like for you as an executive director if you suddenly got a call that said your income per month was about to be doubled? How would that impact you as a person? How would that impact your ministry? And he just went on and on. He said, how do you even articulate that, right? And so he went back and said to his board, I want to give $100 a month to Nepal. Now, unfortunately, his board argued with him, and the board has the final say because they didn't buy the argument. But imagine what would have happened if that worked. And so me, I'm a Youth for Christ missionary. I support 5 YFC staff, 3 of them internationally and 2 of them domestically. And I would love to do a lot more than that. And I'm committed to doing that because I know that if I can support one international staff at $50 a month and another one at $75 a month or whatever the numbers happen to be, for some of them, that is the difference between feeding their family and not, depending on the country we're talking about. So, it will not cost your ministry, I believe, it will not cost your ministry to do this. New inroads into schools. I get speaking engagements all over the place because of my involvement internationally. I get schools that ask me to come into their international studies class and do presentations, into their international business class and do presentations, into their international affairs class and do presentations. And what's fascinating is they always introduce me as this guy from Youth for Christ. And then they kind of apologize for a moment because we're in a secular school system. And then they say, but you should listen to him anyway. And it's really funny to listen to the non-believing teachers defend me that way, right? However, one of the things that we learned right away was this. If your vision for local ministry is only a vision for your town or city, then your vision just might be too small. Highlands, again, Anne would tell you, our vision is to see young people come to faith in Jesus. We see more people come to Jesus through our global involvement than through anything else we do. Why would we not do this? Things we've learned since. Never underestimate the importance of simply showing up. I can't tell you the number of times somebody has said to me, we want your presence, we want your expertise, please come and visit us, more than they've said, we want your money. Let me tell you a couple of quick stories. This is a picture that was taken just back in March. That is my youngest son, Isaac. He's the white one. So that's my youngest son, Isaac, standing beside his best friend, Bubba, in the Gambia. Bubba was a young man who came to faith through the Youth for Christ ministry. He grew up in a Muslim family. His family completely disowned him. We found out a year and a half ago when we were there that Baba was going to be getting married, and he was quite concerned because he was quite sure that most of his family was not going to come. And he looked at Isaac and he said, Isaac, you are my best friend. Would you be my best man? And at that moment I thought, I don't care if I've got to wash dishes in the local restaurant a little bit extra, I'm going to make sure Isaac gets there. And it was because of the friendship that has been developed over a number of years of spending time back and forth. And so this is a huge thing for Isaac as well. I mean, what an amazing honor to be part of this. If we had time, I'd show you some really fun stuff from the wedding. But you can send money all you want. You can't develop a relationship like that simply by writing a check, right? This is a young guy whose name is Joshua. This is in Kokrobite in Ghana. This was also taken just back in March. Joshua right now is 23 years old. We put Joshua through elementary school. His father is a fisherman, his wife is a fishmonger. He had to apply. My wife and I set up a small scholarship fund for this particular village, administered through one of the local churches with the help of Youth for Christ. Not a whole ton of money. I think it cost us about $47 a semester to put Joshua through elementary school. When he applied, he said that he wanted to be in business for himself, and he was quite young at the time, but we just sensed in him just a real passion to learn. He now owns his own bicycle shop in Kokrobite, and just moments before we took this picture, the customer whose bike he's fixing was sitting on that bench behind him, and we walked over to say hi to Joshua. Actually, he ran across the street to greet us because he didn't know we were coming to town. And then he took us over to his shop, and the guy who was sitting on the bench said, "Oh, you are friends of Joshua?" "Yeah, we're friends with Joshua." This is the best bicycle shop in the area. Nobody would take their bike anywhere else. And so Joshua's getting married soon. He's going to start a family. He's respected. He's got a shop on the main street, which is expensive by their standards to do, all because somebody developed a relationship with him that was not dependent on money. It involved a little bit of money, but it was about the relationship. Some of you, Montreal, you know Osana? Do you know Osana? Do you know her story? Who's Montreal? Francois? You're Montreal, yeah?
I know her story little.
Okay. Osana, this is Osana and her husband Garo and the little girl named Agape. What an awesome name for a little girl, right? So Osana and her husband and daughter are refugees from Syria. I met them in 2015 in Lebanon when I was over there doing some training for YFC Lebanon. As I was chatting with her at one point, because she was on staff with YFC Lebanon, working with the Syrian refugee population in Lebanon. So here's a Syrian refugee working with Syrian refugees in Lebanon. As I'm chatting with this lady, who's just an amazing young lady, it came up in the conversation that she had been granted refugee status in Canada. And I said, oh, wow, so when do you arrive in Canada? Well, sometime in December. Where are you going to Canada? Going to Montreal. Who's going to meet you at the airport? Nobody. What do you mean nobody? Her sponsors had all bailed. And my immediate thought was, that's just not acceptable. So I phoned Al Heron from Lebanon and said, Al, there's this young lady, she's a staff member with YFC Lebanon, here's what's happening, told her the story, said, is there anything YFC Montreal can do to help? Al connected with his church, goes on and on and on. She now lives in Montreal, works with YFC Montreal, with the Syrian refugee community in Montreal. This young lady and her daughter, this is Dalia, and I cannot, I'm sad to say, pronounce her daughter's name. Dalia is a refugee from Syria who is currently working with Youth for Christ in Lebanon, and because of these connections and the relationships that have been built, there's 3 churches in my town of Brighton that are working together to bring Dalia here. Part of Dalia's story is that Dalia married someone who ended up being recruited by ISIS, and she's actually in imminent danger in Lebanon. So we are trying to fast track this with the Canadian government, which in itself is a whole different thing. My point here is a partnership can be as simple as a regular prayer meeting and as complex as building schools and having a full sponsorship program, as important as getting somebody out of danger and bringing them here, and everything in between. And you can do this from your local chapter because you are one YFC. We are family together. Kiki, Hector, Nuncio, Viviana. The flags on the back, the ones closest to the Canadian flag, are the 4 people who are here this year. The ones on the outside are the 4 people who were here last year. We began a commitment 7 years ago. We have brought in 27 staff members from 24 countries that we've invested in over the years, and a lot of those have developed into some partnerships. I'm going to quit here because of time, and we just keep learning. It goes on and on and on. I believe that global ministry is local ministry. I hope that this has sort of expanded your thinking about this a bit. If you want to talk to me about this or any of the cross nationals about this, by all means do that. And I'm just going to go right back to the very first slide because my email address is up there just in case you want it. There you go. Thank you very much.